For those of you at home, I'm Adam Goldstein, Artistic Director of Stage Center Theater, and we're so thrilled that all of you can join us as part of like a series of conversations regarding our overall theme of social justice, but then broken down to look at the lens of how theater artists are defining their role in society and how we're looking at theater as a form outside of spaces and how it helps us to take activated approaches to making an impact on our communities. And Kelly Howe from Loyola University is one of the, I like to say, one of the leading authorities locally and internationally on theater and activism and theater and change and theater and community building. And so I'm really honored to have Kelly join us for a brief conversation today as part of this series for you all to be able to think about how your work as artists or how your work as communicators can be harnessed during a moment that seems really challenging, that we tend to focus inward, and how we can start to take simple actions and how we can use our creativity to build outward and use this as an opportunity. So Kelly, thanks for joining us. I don't have a title for our show.
Glad to be here. I'm very glad to be here. Thanks very much for the invitation.
Absolutely. So Kelly, I'd love for you to give our NEIU community just a little bit of a taste of who you are and kind of how you've come to be a part of the specific area that we're going to be talking about today, which is theater of the oppressed. And for many of you, there'll be a helpful link in our YouTube setup with some information about what theater of the oppressed is, about its origins, about Agosto Boal, and about how theater of the oppressed has created an international community, which Kelly, perhaps you can speak to a little bit in terms of like how the lineage of Boal and the lineage of theater of the oppressed has sort of, become this amazing, global collective, if you will, right? In some way, shape, and form, localized and international at the same time, right? So Kelly, for you, like, can you talk a little bit about your journey to for you in terms of your own work, and also how you kind of came to be engaged with and involved with theater of the oppressed, both as a concept and sort of in the larger sense?
So thanks very much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. And no, I think it's important to say with theater of the oppressed, especially probably, and as I think most of my students would probably tell you, I don't think of myself as an authority on it or really anything. But I do, of course, I can speak from experiences and people that I've had the great privilege of learning from, right? And so I'll talk about it from that vantage point. What we all learn together, right? And so I've been involved in one way or another with various aspects of theater of the oppressed, either practice or theory, and of course those things are not separate, right? But for I guess almost 20 years now, I thought, yeah, at least certainly since I first encountered the work of Agosto Boal. And, initially, like a lot of people in the US, I encountered theater of the oppressed initially through the academy, which isn't the primary, I think arguably is not the primary way that people encounter theater of the oppressed in a lot of other parts of the world. It depends on the context, really. But I would say that in the US, right, it was one of the early spaces of multiplication, as Boal would call it. And so I first encountered Boal through his writing. And I have to, I say this a lot, but I was moved in such a world that could give you so few reasons to hope. I was moved by the audacity of writing with so many exclamation points, and of course, not only the writing itself, right, but the vision of what was possible in the world. Sure. that reflected, right? So anyway, this is to say that I work now with theater of the oppressed in a range of ways. So I am a practitioner in various contexts myself, but actually I would say that, and I can talk about that, but I would also say that probably my primary area of focus and organizing and facilitation has been more in the realm of, I guess you could say, both hosting spaces of and for, and the organizing of organizers, right? Meaning that I'm really interested in, and most of my work has been in on a local level, on a regional level, nationally, and also in more of a kind of global solidarity sense. I'm really interested in spaces of learning that bring people together from as many different vantage points, geographically and in terms of experience as possible, for the sharing of insight about how not only theater of the oppressed, but like how work is done in various movement contexts and other organizing contexts around the world. And I believe that our work is made more nuanced and more concrete by encountering each other and hearing about each other's concrete struggles, and then having that shape how we think about our own work in our own context. So whether that's organizing conferences or co-organizing and co-editing collections of works about theater of the oppressed that are trying to have a lot of different voices from many different places, reflecting on both how they work, but also on the concrete struggles in which many of those people are embedded. And so I would say that that kind of organizing spaces for organizers and artists and teachers to learn together has been a through line, in addition to some other kinds of local and global solidarity organizing of various forms. So that's been especially in latter years, that's been more of a focus for me.
It's interesting, that you sort of described like this kind of seamless relationship, between being like you've described yourself kind of as an organizer or as a facilitator, of all of these different convenings, right, in many ways. But like that feels also like an essential part of theater of the oppressed overall, in terms of being able to make creative space happen as well within the context of Boal's work. It feels like, though you sort of describe yourself as part practitioner, part organizer, et cetera, like it feels like there's an interesting like synergy of those two things that happen in theater of the oppressed. Would you say that's true?
I mean, I think definitely it can be the case, right? So
Mm-hmm.
I guess what I would say, right, is that, and this is something that I'm by no means the only person to talk about, but as many of the people from whom I have learned the most about theater of the oppressed would say, right, part of well, first of all, as Boal said, the techniques are made for the people are not made for the techniques. And so the point is not the techniques in and of themselves, but rather how those techniques are being used in concrete struggles for a better world, for a healthier life, for the possibility of joy and thriving. And so I think that there are a lot of people who use theater of the oppressed in a way that is directly about serving and advancing the work of the larger movements in which they are moving, or with whom they're collaborating, depending on the context, sometimes more inside or sometimes more as a partner to a movement, right? And then I think that there are some who kind of would operate in the middle. Sometimes they're working more in a kind of independent facilitator context. I think that there are probably, arguably too often, right? People who are for whom the technique is the thing more than the exact kinds of struggle that the techniques hopefully can advance and be trying to engage in. And so I would say that they're definitely Agosto Boal obviously intended for them to be inextricable, right? The technique and the struggle and the organizing for concrete change, and the techniques themselves. And the techniques, the point of them is not the techniques, right? And so I think that it depends on the context, and there are a lot of beautiful examples, and I can point to some during our conversation, but of people who are really, the techniques are a way of a political sensibility, a way of looking, a way of sensing the world for the purposes of concrete analysis for the dismantling of oppression.
Mm. I love the way you put that at the end, because I find like one of the things that's like super interesting when we talk about theater of the oppressed in general is like it's not necessarily theater as we tend to know it, especially from a colonial standpoint or from a United States,
Right.
hierarchical standpoint. Like it's a very different form to experience in person, right? And I'm curious, for you, about how you've seen the and I'm going to use this term very loosely, how you feel like since you began your relationship to theater of the oppressed, and this kind of goes into a larger conversation about the function of the artist in general today. But I'm curious about how you've seen sort of like the theater of the oppressed form and the theater of the oppressed collective movement evolve over your time working with it, right? Like in what ways have you seen theater of the oppressed applied in new and evolving ways, or in what ways do you feel like theater of the oppressed has always sort of retained its initial connection to its sort of seed movement from Boal? I'm just curious about like the arc that you've seen in terms of the application of theater of the oppressed during your time.
Sure. It's a great question, and it has a couple. I have a couple of answers, all of which connect. But I think that, well, first of all, I would say that my thinking about this has really been shaped by everyone with whom I've worked, but particularly, I would say, by my co-editors of a recent anthology that we worked on together. So it's the Routledge Companion to Theater of the Oppressed. I say that not to advertise it
Not at
actually at all,
all.
but actually just to say that that both my co-editors Julian Boal and Jose Suero, and then also the many contributors, the 60 plus contributors to that book from many different parts of the world, right? Part of what I think working on that book over time, and another collection, another project, and then on the conferences and gatherings, is that you start to see that, well, first of all, part of the idea of the book is that we wanted to explore the idea that obviously that theater of the oppressed, how the world has changed in so many different ways since the 70s, and inevitably theater of the oppressed must change too, and does change, and the ways that people are using it in their particular struggles is changing and evolving, and also kind of discussing the problem of when it doesn't evolve, right? Or when it doesn't, when again a kind of fetishization of the techniques lead to a sort of, I'm going to apply this technique in all settings even as the world changes furiously around me, right? I'm going to assume that a technique that had one political resonance in the 1970s is going to have the same political resonance in my own context today. So a lot of our conversations have been precisely in the hosting of that book, because I think about editing as hosting, I think, as much as anything else. And then in the hosting of these gatherings have been about always thinking about, like, how can we make sure we're not having a kind of sectarianism that leads us to just the techniques are the thing and we're just going to apply them without understanding how the world changes. For example, I guess what I would say, the deepening of neoliberalism, for example, and how that changes how people, the increasing privatization of what would be the commons of the public good, right? Of a notion of something we all share, that affects, I think, some of the critical questions that get asked in theater of the oppressed and that can get asked. But then also I would say about the notion of a movement, I think that the other thing that becomes clear is that theater of the oppressed is practiced in more than 80 countries. And obviously Agosto Boal's books have been translated into a staggering number of languages. And so I think that what becomes clear is it both is and is not. There are moments where it can feel like a global movement or a global community, and there are moments when it can feel like completely disparate struggles and forms of work, right, depending on the context. Like any area of exploration in the arts and politics, right, there are really heated debates that sometimes fracture it that fracture the notion of a global community, right, and really trouble that notion. And I would also say, right, that part of it, one of the central debates is also about, like, what should the techniques be used for and what should they not be used for, right? What does it mean to use? I mean, one of the most popular ones, one of the most popular critiques to make, right, and because it's an important critique to make, is the idea that, of course, theater of the oppressed shouldn't be used for things like human resources, right? Like the idea of using theater of the oppressed to make things go more smoothly within the middle management of a corporation, which we see a lot, right? And so I would say that it is, in some ways, it can feel like a global community or movement, and I definitely think and I think a lot of us are trying to build a sense of broader solidarity, and yet also it's a bunch of different groups and movements and artists and educators who also can feel very separated from each other.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a complex point. I think, like, if we look at today's global climate, right? It's like I feel like for me, at least growing up as an artist, like I've never felt that I've ever in my life had more access, right, to global communities, but at the same time, like in this current moment, feeling incredibly isolated from all those spaces,
Yeah.
right? And I think it's interesting to look at theater of the oppressed in that context, that it is both like a community builder, that feels like a collective philosophy, meaning like it's something we can all share and we can all participate in, we can all engage Boal's work, but that the individual context in which people are facing oppression or are facing systemic inequalities, right, or inequities, or like that those problems are also unique to those individual groups.
Yeah.
Right. And so, like, and it feels like it has a dual sided thing where it's like you can connect global communities through common questions, but that each is also its own very independent experience of theater of the oppressed, right? So it's really interesting to hear you describe it that way. Like, because I think in my mind there's an element that it could be, right, like that it could spark global movements, but it unto itself is not necessarily that, right? Which
Yeah, no, I think it can depend on the context. I've seen it really mobilize people together across national contexts, not to invest too much in the concept of borders, but across national contexts, right? And I've also seen it. I've also seen it be a space of great contestation in terms of how it's used in different places and spaces.
and that feels like, really like a segue, I think, into one of the big questions that we're weighing, in this festival at this moment, regarding, like, you mentioned the word contestation, right, where there are, everybody wants to deploy different methodology in different ways.
Mm.
And I think, like, one of the things that I'm really interested in getting at it through different lenses at this moment, like, as we all sit sort of at this, you know I don't, there's not even a word for it, at such a heightened place of intersection right now, right? It's like that we're, or even more specifically at impasse,
Right.
right? That it's like, this year in so many ways feels like we're at a crossroads of asking really critical questions and have to make choices about which roads and which pathways we want to go down to establish artistic, national, and community identities. And I guess that I'm curious, and through your experience and seeing those contestations about how to deploy certain methodology, like, both from the theater of the oppressed standpoint and from your own personal standpoint, like, what is for you, or what should be really, like, the or what could be, even
Mhm.
more imaginatively, what could be the strongest function or deployment of theatrical artists in this moment, right? And it's a huge question, and I know that you have lots of disparate experiences from different theatrical vocabularies about how to use that question, but I'm just curious, like as we sort of start to, like, get different looks at this for our students, is what should we be doing right now? Right?
Well,
You know what I mean? Like as artists,
yeah.
and if that becomes too broad, then what could we imagine ourselves, in the broader sense, as theatrical artists doing? And I say that because, like, for me, such a big part of this year has been about separating, and we talked about this the other day, about the separation between theater as a space, right, and theater as form,
Yeah.
right, or theater as delivery system.
Yeah.
They're distinctly different things. And it feels a lot like I'm seeing, so much of the narrative about theater at this moment has been about theater the space,
Hmm.
that we can't be in these spaces,
Hmm.
right? But, like, what do you feel like is the sort of is a road that we can take to look at artist function when taking it out of that context? Like, how do you view the function of the artist in this type of moment,
Sure.
given your work on really complex questions?
Sure. It's a great question. And I think that a couple of things come to mind. One would be that, um, well, first of all, I think that obviously, just like you were saying, that theater can be a way of carving out space. And I think that one of the things that theater makers can be doing in this time is, as people are already doing, right? But saying, okay, well, the kinds of conversations and the kinds of questions that we wanted to host, we don't have to stop asking those sincere questions and hosting those sincere questions. We can, whether temporarily or whether for something that is more than temporary, be making sure that we're carving out these other spaces, even if they might not be the ones that they would prefer. Zoom is not my thing, and here we all are, and
Right.
and you can still have moments of immense beauty together and asking questions that I think matter a great deal, and just be present to one another. I guess that brings me to the other thing that I would say, which is that I think that I am mindful of just the widespread suffering of artists, but also of people all over the world right now in this incredibly precarious moment, and obviously especially BIPOC organizers,
Yeah.
artists, and just in general BIPOC communities, right, who are paying disproportionate, well, what would even be proportionate, but who are living such disproportionate consequences of this pandemic. And so I think that I am both really wanting to make sure that theater is continuing in one form or another to have spaces to continue to advance urgent questions, but at the same time, and I'm really worried about the concrete material, like day-to-day paying for the groceries survival of artists. Like I'm worried about that for everyone, which brings me to my other point, which is that at the same time, I think that I am kind of also thinking that the role of artists right now is sometimes not to make art. And I think that that is, well, actually, I'm not going to speak about the role of artists. I can speak about my role as an artist.
Sure.
And I think that for me, I think the best thing I can do as an artist right now is be a part of organizing food networks and be a part of broader anti-racism work and anti-racist struggle. And that might take forms that look theatrical, but actually it relates back to what I was saying about the theater of the oppressed specifically, right? Is that sometimes the techniques are the tools we want to pick up, and sometimes, and where I think we go astray. And I do think this happens sometimes where as theater artists, we can think theater that whatever is happening in any given moment, we need to treat it through theater. We need to address it through theater. We need to advance our struggle through theater. And I think that we obviously need to fight for the vitality of and the essential nature of theater. And I want theater in every way it can be up and running as soon as possible because people's concrete lives depend on it.
So
And
much so, yeah.
I also think that for those of us, I'm trying to spend any extra moments I have, wherever they come up, I'm trying to spend really right now on things that aren't so much theater. And so that's interesting for me. And I think it's an answer sometimes I give that might surprise some of my students, that I think that they might, sometimes I have the sense that maybe sometimes people might expect me to say, like, here's all my answers that are about what we do in the theater and how we're uniquely suited to handle this time. And we're unique, you know what I mean?
Right.
And I think that for me, actually, it's precisely from so many of the people around the world from whom I've learned about theater of the oppressed, and some of the ones who have inspired me most. I think a lot about how sometimes what theater people can be doing is actually laying down their own tools for a while and picking up the tools that other people are asking us to be using in this moment, or that the concrete moment demands. So I think both theater has a really important space of bringing people together, even if online for right now, or in distance realities outside, et cetera. And that we do need to, I also think it's important to witness the moment that we're living. There's something, I mean, all times are disorienting, but there's something really disorienting about this moment. I think for a lot of people, and which isn't to say, like I said, I think that the nature of systems of oppression mean that life can be profoundly disorienting for people in all moments. But I think that it's important to like note the reality that we're living and to not have that slip by, and theater can be a way of hosting witnessing. But I also think at some point, maybe sometimes we can like put down our tools and collect some food.
Yeah, I love that metaphor, at the end, and a conversation I've had with a lot of my students is about, and being able to look at one of the unique skill sets that I think theater artists develop over time, which is how do we figure out how to sit in discomfort and how to actually let discomfort sort of filter through us before having to make something out of it. What does it actually mean to us, right? Is just as important, it feels like, as making. And I love that you brought that idea of bearing witness. Because I know for me, and and I'm sure for you and many of your students and colleagues, like, this year has been so much about, or I guess one of the big positives has been, really taking time to truly listen and to truly see and to truly learn, right? Like during this moment. And it's actually really hard to do both things at the same time, right? It's like, it's hard to like make things and make creative output and like have that learning and have that learning process. And it feels like one of the great tools that theater of the oppressed gives, in many ways, at least sort of in my limited, work with the topic, is that so much of it is actually truly being able to listen to what those experiencing various forms of oppression are going through, right? And to serve as a facilitator of the community voice rather than just as the artist's voice. which I think is like so much been a part of our collective training, which is like, you know, figuring out what it is that I do as an artist, what it is that I can contribute, rather than how is it that I can serve, you
Mhm.
know, other voices in the meantime. And you talked a little bit about, maybe that means spending time at a community food kitchen. Maybe that means, you know, maybe that means writing letters to, you know, to people like isolated in senior homes or senior centers. It's like, there's something about using that particular tool, you know, that has really resonated with me this year. And so I'm really glad that you sort of offer that permission to say, you know, one of the best things that we can do as artists is actually maybe not to make right now, and maybe to figure out like what all it means, and to actually take some processing time.
Mhm.
That's a really, I think that can be really challenging for a lot of artists in the industry, especially when livelihoods are at stake.
I think so. And I think, no, I'm just reminded too that there are a lot of different contexts in which theater of the oppressed, for example, is done. And there is a model that I think is more common in the US, although I can think of several beautiful departures from this.
Hmm.
Uh, uh, 1 second here. Sorry, my Zoom, or can you still hear me okay?
Hmm.
Okay.
Totally.
Anyway, I'll start that sentence again. I think that there are many different ways that people do theater of the oppressed in many different contexts. And one of the things related to what you were just saying that sticks out to me, right, is that in the US, I think it's partly because of how awareness about theater of the oppressed spread here, is that it can be very common to have this model of someone from outside a community who is the artist facilitator and then who is working with that community. And yet I think that if I look more broadly globally, right, we have and sometimes in the US, I think of the Chicago Workers Collaborative's Workers Theater Collective and their work with, in collaboration with Jasmine Cardenas here in
Hmm.
Chicago. But sometimes we have examples that differ from this, but often there's an emphasis on the outside artist coming in and working with a particular community group. And so there can be this frame of like shaping a container, right, in which people are analyzing their oppressions, right? I would say, though, that some of the most moving theater of the oppressed and some of the most concretely exciting theater of the oppressed I have witnessed or have learned about has been in the context of when the facilitator is not completely outside the community, but actually that the investigation is being all done together by people who are sharing that oppression. And it's a model that is less so in the US. So anyway, I also think about like, how can I in this moment not see myself as a theater artist as helping anyone, but also just of being a part of collectively constructing the world we all want to live in.
Yeah, it feels like a really powerful form of allyship when you describe it like that. You know, it's sort of figuring out how best to, like you said, of just being a part of the conversation rather than leading or offering something. That's a really powerful sentiment. It makes me think of, you know, I know a number of wonderful artists who are doing really important work in prison systems.
Mm-hmm.
For example, as I'm sure you've encountered as well,
Yeah,
and you know, and how that simple act of like you said, of being in and sharing in spaces is such an incredibly powerful thing. And I'm curious about, and you referenced the Chicago Workers Collective before, and
mm-hmm.
it seems like a really interesting example of what you're speaking to, with like with voices within a given community sort of engaging in theater of the oppressed practices. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about that and any other recent examples either around Chicagoland, or you also mentioned some global collaborations happening where you've seen, you know, theater of the oppressed sort of really deployed in these beautiful activating ways
Mm-hmm.
recently, like in this moment, because there's never been, I mean, Boal's work itself, and for those of you listening to our conversation or watching our conversation, we'll also post a link to how you can get a copy of Theater of the Oppressed. It's also available in our library as well. And it's such an inspiring read from someone, you know, experiencing multiple forms of oppression, right, like in their own world, and figuring out how to build out of that. And I find that so inspiring within it. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit more about that particular example of the Chicago Workers
Yeah.
Collective, because I just think it's so important for us to see like different forms of creative tools being deployed in that way.
Sure, sure. So I can say a little bit about why the work of the Workers Theater Collective in
Mhm.
collaboration with Jasmine Cardenas, why that work inspires me
Mm-hmm.
a lot. And then also I can refer you all to them and check out their work
Be
and
awesome.
Google their work. But so basically, the Chicago Workers Collaborative is an organization of temporary workers and predominantly African American and Latinx temporary workers who are working in a range of contexts in and outside Chicago. And they, several years ago, started using Theater of the Oppressed as a way of analyzing their experiences, and also particularly as a way of trying to actively, concretely construct unity in their struggles for better working conditions, right? In a context where often in the particular context of some of the factories and other workplaces, they often talk about, for example, the ways that that bosses will try to prevent people from organizing by driving wedges between African American workers and Latinx workers, right? And that this is a dynamic that happens a lot. And so they use Theater of the Oppressed as a way to try to collectively construct unity and a shared sense of struggle and how and what the strategies and tactics look like. And it's just one Theater of the Oppressed, just one area of their work, and it's embedded in a much larger work of organizing. And so for the last several years, they have been growing that work, and then eventually made the Workers Theater Collective of Chicago Workers Collaborative in collaboration with Jasmine, who is an extraordinary artist, educator, and organizer in Chicago. So I refer you to find out more about their work, but it's a beautiful example.
Could you possibly, so just for our audience, like I'm just curious if you can sort of describe, you know, because Theater of the Oppressed has any number of facets to it, right? So I'm curious about how you saw some of the tools of Theater of the Oppressed deployed in that specific circumstance. Like, what does it look like? You know, how did that project sort of, you know, start? Like, what is the conversation that sparks it? And then kind of like, what does it look like when you bring in, because I think we're all sort of used to, in many ways, being in theatrical spaces with other theater artists,
Yeah.
right? But what does it start to look like when you're taking members of the actual community, right, working in that factory? Like what is it, like, just briefly, like what does that process look like, and then how does it grow into what you're talking about?
Sure. I, you know, like I said, Jasmine can say more, but I have a
Mm-hmm.
couple of times been, Jasmine and I collaborate a lot, and I've collaborated with CWC some as well, some members of CWC. And so I have been a guest facilitator for them
Mm-hmm.
sometimes, so I can talk a little bit about their process from my understanding.
Mm-hmm.
But so basically several years ago, Jasmine had thought that maybe Theater of the Oppressed might be an exciting tool in her having encountered work with CWC in other contexts. And so then the way that started to take shape initially was that that Jasmine and Willa Taylor and I were collaborating on some summer offerings as part of a Theater of the Oppressed collective that we were involved in Chicago. And so what we decided to do was sort of expand those. And when Julian Boal was in Chicago for some programming, Julian also collaborated with the Chicago Workers Collaborative. And
Mm-hmm.
so through both through Jasmine's longtime facilitation and through the workers' desire to be studying and learning about Theater of the Oppressed themselves, through Julian's collaboration, all of that work, eventually they started using Theater of the Oppressed as a way to analyze aspects of their daily life, analyze situations like in workshop settings themselves,
Mm-hmm.
not necessarily that which was becoming a scene that would be publicly shared, but then also started building forum theater scenes, building forum theater scenes. So for anybody who's not familiar with forum theater, the idea is that a scene or a play that is investigating a form of oppression, a situation of oppression, will be staged the whole way through. And then the second time around, anyone who is in the audience can become, as Boal would call them, a spect-actor and step on stage and try to rehearse strategies for struggling against that oppression. And so, for example, CWC makes forum theater scenes that they share with members of various communities. Sometimes it's about building alliances with people who might not themselves be temporary workers or even be aware of temporary worker struggles. So they might have a community event where they have a forum theater session and they invite people who might not even be temporary workers to step on stage and be in conversation with them so that they can, in the act of having that forum and having people invest in that moment, build alliances so that the next time they're going to go and do a manifestation outside of a factory or outside of a workplace, those people will be, so it's a way of building relationship and spreading awareness of the situation of workers, and also about a kind of collective analysis for themselves of the lives they're living and the strategies that they're using to struggle against oppression. So that really is moving to me,
Yeah.
in terms of they make really beautiful theater.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right? Because like everything that you're talking about really blurs so many lines of what we think of, especially in the United States. And I think the United States is a very specific, at least dominating view of what theater is, and it's a very privileged view of what theater is, and it creates very privileged spaces around us. And I think like the way that you're describing it, it really blurs, and Michael Roth has called it civic theater practice, and I think that like it's blurs being a conscientious and activated citizen,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like with theater in both the way that we've seen it in the past and then not,
Yeah.
right? So it's interesting, like you're talking about like this really complex community building exercise,
Mm-hmm.
simply about that feels frankly like one of the most emotionally resonant things that I feel really moved in hearing you talk about is bringing those who have been systematically and systemically isolated from each other into shared space,
Mm-hmm.
right? And I hear you sort of reflecting that a little bit, especially when you talk about a corporate strategy to say break workers apart from each other,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
That like that this space then feels like, no, this is actually working against that, to know you're not alone, you're not actually alone, you're not actually alone, and you all have this larger voice. That's a really moving thing to be a part of.
Yeah. I think that some of the theater of the oppressed that I have, that has stayed with me the most, either that I have been a part of or that I have witnessed, has been particularly that which is focused on the difficult work of constructing alliances, relationships, etc.
Mm,
Right? Because of course, oppression isn't dismantled alone, and so recognizing the kind of the space of theater of the oppressed as a possibility for building collective strength,
yeah.
is something that moves me. And some of the examples that I would point to outside of the U.S. too, some of the groups that have inspired me most. Also, I would say that there's a shared sense of that. Jana Sanskriti, which is the largest movement of theater of the oppressed in the world, and is based in West Bengal. And an extraordinary movement of theater of the oppressed, truly a people's movement of theater of the oppressed, and using theater of the oppressed alongside many other ways of organizing together, and have been doing that work for decades. And so I would want to note how much so much of what I have learned has been in one way or another from contact with Jana Sanskriti. Another example I might give related to your question is Escola de Teatro Popular, which is in Rio de Janeiro, and it is a school, it translates to popular theater school, but where popular theater techniques, various forms of popular and political theater, are taught for free to all participants, and often those who are learning then also become the teachers, and where it's essentially free popular theater education for specifically militants from grassroots movements in Brazil. And so the idea, their recent project, to give one example, is Citizenship on Stage. And in Citizenship on Stage, the idea is that they host, basically it's about trying to participate in building cultural strength and helping to build or expand the cultural wing of various movements by hosting spaces where relatively predominantly younger militants are continuing to sort of build their relationship to movement through theater. They host these spaces inside what they would call basically pre-test schools where people prepare to take tests to enter university. And so they embed these free classes in popular theater as a way that are hosted by schools that have relationships to social movements, so that the theater is always tied to social movement work. So what, as you can tell, sort of a through line for me, and the people from whom I have felt really grateful to learn, has been this sense of like never disconnecting it from larger movements that are about more than theater.
Yeah, it's so, I love that connection to make, particularly because like as you're talking, it's so easy to think of it's so easy for the world to become overwhelming, right?
Mm.
Like in terms of how many different forms and how many different variations on cultural and systemic and economic oppression that one would encounter.
Yeah.
And so it's heartening, I think, to hear you sort of talk about just being mindful of like the connective tissue, right? Like it feels like a big challenge would be trying to, because even when Boal was originally writing, right, like he's responding to, yes, global oppression, but also to the very localized experience of oppression that he himself and his own communities, or that he was witnessing around him, was going through. So it becomes really easy to try to look at the world in its state as a very um as insurmountable,
Yeah.
right? And it sounds like the things that you're talking about are like the really resonant value of working in small and localized spaces, and how that then just connects outward in each of these instances. And would you say and you mentioned Brazil as well, sort of the kind of root foundation of Boal's own work.
Mhm.
And I'm curious, like as you look at this type of work, in the current climate, where at least from I can only speak for me, that like everything feels so weighty and so heavy, and that there's so many things to tackle at the same time. Like does Theater of the Oppressed sort of speak to that in some way, like in its original sort of conception, like the notion that like, there's so many different avenues for oppression, and like how do we and that, but that our small actions are key? Or does it sort of look at the ripple effect, or talk about the ripple effect between like the small gathering in these large spaces? Because you're describing like very accessible actions, I think, for a lot of people that they can take. But I
Mhm.
think sometimes I feel like one of the obstacles we all face, especially artistically, is like, is it enough? And is it meaningful? And I'm curious about like what Theater of the Oppressed sort of looks at those types of micro macro relationships, at least from your experience.
Mhm. So I think that, and there are a couple of examples I can point to for this, but I think that, um, like Augusto Boal himself always suggested, and like so many of the artists and educators and organizers who use Theater of the Oppressed I've encountered have suggested, I think that one thing that's crucial about this moment and all moments is that theater is never enough. And that it's all like, and that doesn't mean to kind of, I don't say that to kind of create or feed this sort of already constant sense of devaluing of the arts that we see, especially in a US context and a lot of other contexts too.
Right.
It's not that, but I think that, that it's, as Boal said, and as a lot of other practitioners have talked about, it's like actually when we leave the theater, Sanjay
Mhm.
Ganguly, the founding director of Janus and Screedy says this, right, too. It's like when we leave the theater, our work begins, right? So even though the idea is that we are spectators, right, we're spectators turned actors within the space in Theater of the Oppressed, at the same time, it's one moment in a much longer series of moments. And so I think that for me, Theater of the Oppressed was always situated within a reminder that it's a lens and it's a way of struggle and it's a political sensibility that it is never the end point, and it's not the end in itself. Um, so I guess I would say that I think that the other piece is for me, um, that Theater of the Oppressed also is a sensibility that suggests that I think, that suggests that people have a right to something more than mere survival. Um, and I think that this to me seems really important to remember in the times we are living. It's always important to remember, but I think that there's a way in which, certainly in nations like the US, where there can be such aggressive logic of neoliberalism and austerity, that would suggest that sometimes it doesn't even suggest that people have a right to survival, that all
Right.
people have a right to survival, but that actually, there can be this sort of mentality of like, oh, well, people should only, people only need the bare minimum, and that people who are struggling are shamed for wanting more than just the minimum that it is to survive.
Right.
And I think that, Boal often talked about, there's the slogan that he had when he ran for city council in Rio de Janeiro, which was "Have the courage to be happy," right? And of
Mm.
course, on the one hand, happiness is not so simple, right? To say have the courage to be happy. But I think that there's something else that there's something much deeper, politically speaking, in that slogan that I think about a lot in these times, is that we have a way in which those who have a great deal have a tendency to shrug off the suffering of those who don't, by suggesting that not everyone deserves joy and thriving, right? Like, not, this sort of mentality that it's going to shake out how it's going to shake out. And even if and just surviving, you should be grateful for that. Whereas I think that Theater of the Oppressed suggests that everyone deserves joy and pleasure and a full-bodied experience of the world, and that one of the things we have to struggle against is the way that are the ways that people's bodies are taken from them in various ways, whether through the deadly violence of the state or whether through the deadly violence of the workplace, especially certain kinds of workplaces that literally destroy workers' bodies, right? I think that Theater of the Oppressed not only offers some ways of struggling, among many other important ways of struggling, but I think that it also reminds us that it is not greedy to want joy. It is not wanting too much to want pleasure, and to believe that you deserve something more than mere survival. And I think we need to remind ourselves of that every day, so that we are all participating in constructing a world that recognizes that everyone should have that. Everyone has that right.
Mm, I love that. That's such an inspiring thought to sort of bring our conversation, toward a close. And you used a word before that I think like is really resonating with me differently now than when we first began, which is that of the spect-actor. Sort of a clever literary term, like on the page, but then sort of hearing what you're talking about, that we have like this shared responsibility, right, to witness each other's desires for those things that are just basic human innate desires and rights, right, that feel sadly so in jeopardy.
Yeah.
Right, and that we have the shared responsibility to see it and to act upon it collectively. And I think that that's a really powerful testament to Theater of the Oppressed and to Boal's lineage and to the work that you're doing, as a whole, and really inspiring in a time that can feel really helpless, that like just to feel like, no, like that the function of this root of looking at theater is actually at its core that you described. It's how do we make this seemingly simple human desire and human need truly shared, right? Which is like that's a really wonderful way of thinking about it, and thank you for framing it that way. I think that that's a really inspiring thought to kind of like take into the mix. I'm curious, I'm sure that some of our students and community might be interested to know that if they're interested in finding out more about Theater of the Oppressed, or in ways that they can potentially get involved in, like what are some helpful routes that they might take. I know that there are localized branches, right, and various sort of separate organizations of Theater of the Oppressed around the world. Can you talk a little bit briefly about how that works and how students might want to get involved?
Sure, absolutely. I guess one thing is that you can just, first of all, feel free to reach out and contact me via my address on the Loyola website. And I can then, I'd be happy to meet with anybody and talk specifically about what their areas of interest might be. So I could maybe figure out what the best places. I'm always happy to have those kind of chats. Where would be the best places to connect them? But then on the local level, I and several collaborators within a larger collective try to organize various learning opportunities, so I can put people on like just mailing lists for that, we try, I think, also within that collective to amplify each other's struggles. There's a Facebook page that you can check out called Theater of the Oppressed and Activism in Chicago that tries to open up space for people to share about work that they're doing. But then also one of the primary spaces in which I've been working for a long time now is Pedagogy and Theater of the Oppressed, PTO, an international organization that convenes gatherings for artists, educators, activists, organizers, researchers, right? So basically anyone interested in the use of not only Theater of the Oppressed and Pedagogy of the Oppressed, but also other interactive ways of organizing for a more just world, that we host an annual conference. And so you could go to PTO's website, ptoweb.org, to find out more, but also I'm happy to meet with anybody to talk more about that. And we're supposed to, just so everyone knows, I think it's important to know that Chicago was and is going to be the home of the 25th annual Pedagogy and Theater of the Oppressed conference. And that was scheduled for May 2020 with the theme of popular power, poder popular. And that conference has been rescheduled for 2021. And we hope to be able to go forward with the date we have, but it's very possible that that will be moving back even a bit more, but we're staying in touch with our community. But so for people who, you know, in the university community there, who might want to be involved, it would be very easy to kind of connect locally with loads of different opportunities. And we'll have, you know, I'm hopeful that that conference goes forward in person. And if we do, it will mean that we'll have really interesting people doing this work in many different contexts around the world here physically in Chicago with us. So there's a lot of different ways to connect. And also, you know, there are several different amazing schools and collectives around the world with whom I'd be happy to connect people, and that I think also that offer both online, but also when people can be together in time and space again, offer extraordinary opportunities to go and study. For example, Jana Sanskriti hosts every 2 years a Forum Theater Festival that also has workshops where people can go and learn. And I was enormously grateful to have the opportunity to learn there, so I could connect people with those kinds of opportunities elsewhere too.
It's remarkable. There's so much going on, even in this moment, that I think it's a great reminder to all of us that even complicated moments like this are actually great opportunities, right? And thank you for the work that you're doing, and thank you for the work that you're facilitating, and thank you for inspiring students and faculty and colleagues and artists alike across the industry and across the world. I remember the sort of first meeting you, and just feeling like, that was how you talked about theater and its function, right, was so activating toward my own purpose. And I have found, our conversations instrumental sort of in shaping, what I want, I know, my own work and my teaching to be able to do. And thank you for constantly giving of yourself to larger communities. It's really meaningful. And I know in a complicated time, I find that really heartening. So thank you for all that you're doing. And thank you for joining us for the Digital Theater Festival for Social Justice. Kelly Howe from Loyola University. Thanks so much.
Thanks for having me. Thanks very much for having me.
Sure thing. And